It was the gun that tore through the icy battlefields of the Eastern Front. Lightweight, brutally fast, and impossible to ignore, the PPH-41 wasn't just a submachine gun. It was Stalin's answer to Germany's firepower. With a drum magazine that held 71 rounds and a rate of fire so rapid it sounded like ripping cloth. The PPSh-41 transformed entire battles. Soviet soldiers didn't just carry it, they swarmed with it, overwhelming enemies with sheer volume. And while it looked simple, there was genius buried in that stamped metal frame. So, how did the PPSh-41 become the backbone of the Red Army during World War II? Why did it remain in use long after the war across countries and continents from Korea to Vietnam to modern-day rebel conflicts? In this video, we'll uncover the full truth. How it was made, how it worked, and why even today the PPSh-41 still earns respect from weapons experts around the world. What you're about to hear is the untold story of the gun that changed history, one blazing burst at a time. The story of the PPSh-41 doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in desperation. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, sending millions of troops crashing into Soviet territory. The Red Army was completely unprepared. Their infantry was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. German troops were equipped with the deadly MG-34 and MP-40, weapons that gave them unmatched firepower in mobile warfare. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were still using outdated bolt, action Mosin-Nagant rifles, and the unreliable PPD-40 submachine gun. The PPD was expensive to produce, required skilled labor, and broke down easily under battlefield stress. Stalin's generals knew they needed something better, and fast. The solution came from a relatively unknown Soviet weapons designer named Georgy Spagin. He proposed a submachine gun that was simple, cost-effective, and brutally efficient. The design emphasized stamped metal parts over machined ones, dramatically cutting down manufacturing time. Even the woodstock could be crudely formed. His goal was to create a weapon that could be mass-produced by unskilled labor in factories evacuated east of the Urals far from the advancing German lines. The prototype was rushed through testing and approved by Stalin himself, who saw it as essential to saving the Red Army from collapse. Production began before the ink was dry on the final design documents. By late 1941, the weapon was officially designated the PPSh-41. It fired the powerful 7.62x25 Memortuk round, a cartridge with exceptional velocity and penetration, and used a drum magazine capable of holding 71 rounds. When the Red Army issued the first batches to frontline troops, they knew immediately this wasn't just another gun. It was a turning point. The PPSh-41 wasn't elegant. It was raw. But it was that brutal simplicity that made it so powerful. It was made primarily of stamped steel, which meant parts could be pressed into shape rather than carved or mill. In wartime conditions, that wasn't just efficient. It was revolutionary. Each PPSh-41 could be built in just a few hours by workers who had no experience with weapons manufacturing. And in Stalin's war machine, that meant everything. The gun used a blowback action and was open bolt, which meant that every time a round was fired, the bolt stayed open, ready to slam forward again. It had no selector switch. It was full auto only. That meant when you pulled the trigger, the PPSh-41 unleashed a blinding storm of bullets at a staggering 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That rate of fire gave it its terrifying nickname, the burp gun. On the battlefield, it sounded like tearing fabric. To the Germans, it was the sound of death. But firepower wasn't the only advantage. The PPSh-41 had range. Thanks to the high-velocity Tokarev round, it could hit targets up to 150 nm away with accuracy that was nearly double what most submachine guns could manage at the time. The weapon was also praised for its reliability in the mud, snow, and frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front. It kept working long after other weapons jammed or froze. German soldiers often ditched their MP-40s and picked up PPSh-41s from fallen Soviets whenever they had the chance. That alone speaks volumes. Perhaps the most iconic feature of the PPSh-41 was its massive drum magazine. With 71 rounds, a single soldier could unleash a continuous stream of bullets without reloading. In the chaos of trench raids and urban combat, that was a game-maker. There was also a 35-round stick magazine option, preferred by some troops because it was easier to reload and more reliable. But nothing matched the psychological impact of the full drum. A single man with a PPSh-41 could pin down an entire squad if used correctly. It gave Soviet infantry the edge they needed to turn the tide. The Red Army didn't just hand out the PPSh-41 and hope for the best. They built entire tactics around it. Infantry squads were restructured to maximize the weapon's power. A typical Soviet squad in 1942 might have 2 or 3 men armed with PPSh-41s supporting the rest of the riflemen. But by 1943, entire units were being armed almost exclusively with the PPSh-41. In some cases, whole battalions stormed German lines wielding nothing but submachine guns. It was overwhelming, noisy, terrifying. The Soviets understood that war on the Eastern Front was often fought at close range in forests, ruins, and trenches. That's where the PPSh-41 thrived. It wasn't a long distance marksman's tool. It was designed for closing the distance fast and breaking through enemy positions with a wave of lead. When paired with shock tactics, smoke, grenades, and raw aggression, the PPSh-41 gave Soviet troops the ability to swarm and overwhelm enemy defenses in minutes. One famous tactic was the night raid. Under cover of darkness, Soviet troops would sneak close to German lines, then rush in at dawn, screaming with bayonets and PPSh-41s blazing. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was psychological warfare. Entire German outposts were overrun in minutes. Some defenders simply broke and ran, unable to withstand the sudden wall of fire. Soviet commanders also trained their troops to conserve ammo by firing in short bursts. Despite its huge magazine, the PPSh-41's rate of fire could empty it in under 5 seconds. Discipline mattered. A well-trained soldier could suppress multiple enemies and still have rounds left to defend his position. As the war progressed, Soviet production increased. By 1945, over 6 million units had been manufactured, and the Red Army was no longer under-equipped. They were now the best-equipped infantry in the war. When it came to close-quarters firepower, the PPSh-41 didn't just dominate the battlefield with bullets. It broke morale. German infantry units reported a specific kind of fear when they encountered Soviet troops armed with it. It wasn't just about firepower. It was the noise. The PPSh-41's rapid rate of fire didn't sound like conventional gunfire. It sounded like a mechanical scream. That high, pitched, rapid-fire burp echoed across frozen forests and ruined cities, warning enemy troops that a Soviet assault was moments away. In close-quarters fighting, the gun's presence changed everything. Rooms were cleared in seconds. Trenches were overrun in minutes. Its massive drum magazine gave Soviet soldiers a terrifying edge in suppressive fire. Most submachine guns of the era, like the German MP-40, only held 32 rounds. The PPSh-41 had more than double that, and it could fire it faster. That kind of sustained output was psychologically devastating in an ambush or tight combat scenario. Even in defense, the PPSh-41 made a statement. During the brutal battles of Stalingrad and Leningrad, where entire blocks were fought over one building at a time, Soviet soldiers used the weapon to devastating effect. They'd set up ambush points inside buildings, behind rubble, or in sewers. When German troops advanced, the PPSh-41 came alive, unloading in short, ruthless bursts. The Germans called it Die Maschine, or the sewing machine for its sound. But unlike a sewing machine, it stitched death, Captured German diaries described entire platoon halted in fear by one man firing from cover with a PPSh-41. Its sound alone became enough to make officers second-guess assaults. It wasn't precision that gave the gun its reputation. It was volume. The psychological warfare it waged was nearly as powerful as the physical destruction it caused. And that fear wasn't just limited to German troops. Even within the Red Army, soldiers respected the gun as an extension of their power, a symbol of the Soviet ability to strike back. The PPSh-41 was a Soviet weapon, but ironically, it was also one of the most used German weapons of the war. That's not a joke. German troops captured so many PPSh-41s from the battlefield, especially after Stalingrad, that they started issuing them to their own men. Whole divisions on the Eastern Front were equipped with captured versions. In fact, the Wehrmacht even produced its own 9mm conversion kits to allow the use of German ammunition in the PPSh-41. They renamed it the MP-77R and treated it as official military gear. Why? Because it worked. Even the enemy couldn't deny its effectiveness. The PPSh-41 was simple to use, reliable in brutal conditions, and unmatched in volume of fire. German soldiers respected it so much that they'd pick it up off the battlefield rather than stick with their issued MP-40. In some divisions, commanders actively sought out PPSh-41s to better prepare for Soviet-style urban warfare. Think about that. A Soviet weapon was so effective that the Nazis willingly armed their own men with it. Back on the Soviet side, adaptability was key. Factories across the Soviet Union modified the gun depending on regional needs. In the harsh winter conditions of the Eastern Front, versions with insulated trigger groups were produced so soldiers could fire it with gloves on. Some were painted white for winter camouflage. Others were adjusted to fit better on tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels. But the biggest field modification was always the magazine. While the 71-round drum was iconic, it wasn't perfect. It rattled, it was heavy, and early versions had feeding issues. So, Soviet troops often modified their PPSh-41s to accept the 35-round stick magazine instead. This made it lighter, easier to reload, and more reliable in sustained combat. In elite units like the Soviet Naval Infantry or reconnaissance squads, this version became the standard. This adaptability is what helped the PPSh-41 stay in frontline use for decades after World War II. Even when newer weapons came out, soldiers often chose to keep it. It was trusted, it was battle-proven, and it never failed them when things got ugly. By 1944, the Red Army was no longer defending its homeland. It was advancing. As they pushed west through Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany, the PPSh-41 became the centerpiece of Soviet assault tactics. It was especially suited to urban warfare. In bombed-out buildings, narrow alleyways, and subway tunnels, the gun was unmatched. It didn't require precise aiming. It required volume and violence, and it delivered both. Soviet troops often worked in pairs during building sweeps. One soldier kicked down doors or tossed grenades, and the other cleared the room with a PPSh-41. That room-clearing method became standard doctrine for years to come and influenced post-war military tactics across the globe. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces both took notes. The idea of suppressive fire in enclosed spaces became fundamental, and it all came from how the Soviets used the PPSh-41. After the war ended, the gun didn't fade away. It spread. The Soviet Union shipped thousands of PPSh-41s to allies and satellite states across the globe. It saw action in Korea where North Korean and Chinese troops used it to great effect against UN forces. American troops armed mostly with M1 Garands and carbines were stunned by the sheer volume of lead coming from PPSh-41 squads. It forced US commanders to re-evaluate how they approached close-range engagements. The gun appeared again in Vietnam. Used by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army in thick jungle and tight ambush situations, the PPSh-41 reigned supreme once again. Its sound was feared. Its silhouette became familiar. It was the gun of revolution, resistance, and asymmetric warfare. And that's just scratching the surface. From Africa to the Middle East, Latin America to the Balkans, the PPSh-41 became the weapon of the underdog. Guerrilla movements, liberation armies, and insurgents adopted it. Why? Because it was cheap, reliable, easy to maintain. And when the shooting started, it could outgun almost anything. The PPSh-41 wasn't just a Soviet invention. It was a global phenomenon. It proved that with the right design, even a hastily built, ugly industrial machine could change the course of history. One of the most defining characteristics of the PPSh-41 was how effective it became in urban environments. During the brutal house-to-house fighting in places like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Berlin, the PPSh-41 turned into an almost mythic weapon for Soviet troops. Its compact size and extreme rate of fire made it ideal for close-quarters battle, where engagement distances were often measured in feet rather than yards. In the tight hallways of bombed-out buildings or the trenches carved through rubble, soldiers didn't need long-range rifles. They needed overwhelming firepower at short range, and the PPSh-41 delivered. The design was so efficient in this type of warfare that entire Soviet platoon would sometimes be outfitted with nothing but the PPSh-41. This created a kind of mobile storm squad that could lay down a storm of bullets in seconds, flooding enemy positions with a wall of lead. German troops who faced Soviet forces in the cities feared the sound of the PPSh-41 more than almost anything else. One Wehrmacht soldier wrote in a letter that the rattling of the Russian drum gun in the distance was a warning. They were coming close and they were coming fast. Its effectiveness led to changes in German tactics. German troops tried to avoid street fighting with Soviet units that were heavily armed with PPSh-41s, unless they had superior numbers or tank support. In many reports, they spoke of being pinned down by just a handful of Soviet soldiers equipped with the gun. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical one. The drum magazine spitting out 900 rounds per minute sounded like a buzzsaw, a terrifying audio cue that meant instant death if you were caught in its path. Soviet generals began forming specialized units that used the PPSh-41 almost exclusively. These shock troops became experts in room clearing, ambushing, and rapid flanking attacks. Their job was to break through fortified positions and clear buildings street by street, floor by floor. Without the PPSh-41, it's likely the Red Army would have had a much harder time taking back the devastated cities of the Soviet Union. Even after World War II ended, the PPSh-41 didn't disappear. In fact, it began a second life in post-war conflicts around the world. The Soviet Union had manufactured millions of units, and many of them were distributed to Allied nations and revolutionary groups from China to North Korea to Vietnam, and even parts of Africa. The PPSh-41 showed up wherever communist movements or Soviet-supported forces were active. During the Korean War, North Korean and Chinese soldiers used the PPSh-41 in large numbers. American troops reported that the weapon's high rate of fire made nighttime engagements especially dangerous. In some cases, American infantry found themselves outgunned in close-range ambushes where the M1 Garand simply couldn't compete with the sheer volume of bullets a PPSh-41 could unleash in a few seconds. Entire U.S. squads were pinned down by one or two PPSh-41s in the right terrain. It was in Korea that American military analysts started seriously reevaluating their assumptions about what constituted superior firepower. In Vietnam, both the Viet Minh and later the Viet Cong used the PPSh-41 against French, South Vietnamese, and U.S. troops. Its rugged design made it ideal for the jungles of Southeast Asia. Even with limited access to spare parts, the gun could keep working with minimal care. Some versions were modified to accept AK-47 magazines or other locally sourced parts. These improvised hybrid weapons were a testament to the gun's versatility and enduring design. Decades after it was originally built, the PPSh-41 remained a weapon of choice for guerrilla fighters and insurgent forces. Its low production cost, combined with its ease of use and devastating firepower, ensured it remained relevant far longer than most military planners expected. In some African conflicts during the 1980s and 1990s, the PPSh-41 was still showing up in battlefield photos almost 50 years after it was first issued to Soviet troops. So, what is it about the PPSh-41 that gives it such legendary status even 80 years later? Part of it is the sheer practicality of its design. In an age of precision-guided missiles, the digital targeting systems, the PPSh-41 reminds us that sometimes simplicity wins. It didn't need advanced optics or polymer frames. It just needed to fire quickly, hold a lot of ammunition, and not break down in the mud, snow, or heat of battle. But it's more than just its technical features. The PPSh-41 came to symbolize something larger: the resourcefulness of a nation under siege. It was forged during one of the darkest periods of human history and became the voice of resistance, grit, and survival. Its very existence told a story that a simple, rugged tool in the hands of determined people could turn the tide of a war. Today, the PPSh-41 is a collector's item, a museum piece, and a historical icon. In reenactments, films, and documentaries, it still roars to life, representing the thunderous pace of Soviet infantry during the war. It's no exaggeration to say that this weapon helped win a world war, and unlike many of its contemporaries, it still has a presence, not just in old armories, but in the minds of those who study history, warfare, and survival. Its DNA can even be found in the designs of modern submachine guns. The idea that a single weapon could be mass-produced, simple to train with, reliable in combat, and devastating at close range became a standard. While newer firearms have replaced it in modern arsenals, the PPSh-41's spirit lives on in every lightweight, high-capacity firearm carried by soldiers today. It's not just a gun, it's a legacy, one forged in steel, tempered by war, and carried forward by the echo of every round fired in defense of something greater.